Hi, this is a effort to apply a technique called causal loop modeling to an example that's very local to where I live in Huntsville, Alabama, regarding race, education, and housing choice. So Huntsville is under a desegregation order for its public schools. And one reason that the desegregation order is significant, but not the only reason, is that there's good empirical evidence demonstrating that racial minorities end up with more vulnerable lives across all ages and for all causes of mortality. Here's a pathway that explains why, a causal pathway. The explanation for the first link from racial school segregation to economic opportunity spread is that so this is in effect saying that the more segregated a school is, or the more segregated schools are in a city, the more the economic opportunities are spread out through the city. And what the explanation for this is that the relative availability and strength of stereotypes, role models, and social networks influences this. The explanation for the second link, that the more economic opportunity is spread out, the more economic outcomes are spread out too. They're different for different groups of people. The explanation for this is that prolonged exposure to impoverished conditions weakens work ethics, devalues academic success, removes stigmas associated with imprisonment and failure. Now, there are many explanations for the third link. Why would the more economic outcomes spread out? Why would health outcomes then also tend to be more spread out? Some explanations are things like the lower availability and higher prices for groceries, insurance, and other services, the higher prevalence of predatory and vice-providing services like payday loan stores and tobacco stores. Now, if you endorse civil rights, if you think race shouldn't be a factor in making some people's lives more precarious than others, you should view this pathway as problematic, not only as a legal wrong that should be redressed, but also as a moral wrong that should be righted. Now, the main immediate cause of schools being segregated by race is neighborhoods being segregated by race. The more neighborhoods are segregated by race, the more schools are segregated by race. And this is because we do school assignments by residential district, at least in the United States, at least in Huntsville, Alabama. When desegregation issues come up in Huntsville, everyone typically takes this cause as a given. Now, Huntsville, it turns out, has a fairly high degree of racial residential segregation. See this map here. Green represents black families. Blue dots represent white families, and you can see that in what's called Northwest Huntsville, it's a lot of green. Southwest Huntsville, a lot of blue. Also tends to be the case that the good schools, where the lot of blue is, and the bad schools, where the lot of green is. Now, I think it's worth pressing in to some causes for why neighborhoods are segregated by race, for the sake of revealing some dynamics that tend to get ignored when we talk about schools being segregated by race. So, what causes neighborhoods to be segregated by race? Here's one idea. People have a preference to live in a good school district. It just so happens, of course, that schools serving mostly racial minorities never qualify as good, at least in Huntsville, Alabama. So the more there's a perception that some schools are better than others, the more there's segregation in neighborhoods by race. Just because the white schools tend to be perceived as better than schools that serve majority black populations or majority non-white populations. Now, what's interesting is this preference for good quality schools creates a reinforcing feedback loop. The preference for living in a good school district tends to exacerbate racial residential segregation, and that's because economic outcomes contribute to the perception of school district quality. The more people coming from a neighborhood succeed economically, the more people think that they must have good schools there. And the less they succeed economically, the more people perceive their schools as not being as good of a quality. So here is a first insight from our efforts to do causal loop modeling. At least one cause of racial residential segregation makes the moral problem concerning the spread in health outcomes across racial groups worse. That's because positive feedback loops amplify. But we don't even need to think about these long-term outcomes to find a reinforcing loop. You don't need to go so far down the road as economic outcomes. That's because residential segregation also contributes to nearer term, shorter term, test score disparities. That's surprising. It's not the evidence. If you haven't figured it out, I'm giving you citation information for the peer-reviewed publications on which I'm relying, empirical studies. So it's not that what school you go to determines this, how you score on standardized tests. It's what neighborhood you live in. That's weird. And this is because, and then you see this positive feedback loop that the more people have a preference to live in a good school district, the more that the neighborhoods tend to be segregated by race, the more that the test scores tend to be spread out. And of course, if you think, hey, the students at this school score really good on these tests, you think that school's really good. Students at this school score really bad on the test, that must be a bad school. Right? And you think that because we use test scores as a quantitative proxy for qualitative comparisons about school goodness. So test scores, once you put those in, also exacerbate this moral problem of a disparity based on race for health outcomes. Here's another idea for what causes racial residential segregation: a preference for a good investment for building home equity. Because what happens, or what counts as a good investment in a home, of course, just never happens to be homes in neighborhoods where racial minorities are the majority. People are never like, wow, in Huntsville at least, wow, look at all the racial minorities that are going to live there. I'm going to get a great return on my home investment there. Maybe they buy it as a rental property to extract money from that community, but they don't buy it as a home to help build the community. They tend to think, wow, here's this white neighborhood. That's a really good home investment. Just so happens that they tend to be correlated by race. So the more there's a difference in the spread of home values, the more neighborhoods tend to be segregated by race, because people want to make a good investment in their home. So this preference for having a good investment in choosing where to live supports yet another reinforcing feedback loop. The preference for buying a house that's a good investment tends to exacerbate racial residential segregation. And this is because white people also tend to exhibit a preference for same race dominant neighborhoods where there's at most token representation from minorities. Some interesting empirical evidence on that too. Let's do one more cause: the preference to live in a safe neighborhood. The more there's a perception that some neighborhoods are safer than others, or some have more crime than others, the more there is segregation of neighborhoods by race. Because it just so happens that perceptions of safety tend to track the racial composition of the neighborhood. Now, this cause exacerbates the reinforcing feedback loop associated with wanting a good return on your investment, on your home investment, because it feeds in, right? You got to sort of go from start at perceived crime spread and then go down to racial residential segregation. And then you can get into all sorts of other loops that don't involve the perceived crime spread, that are positive reinforcing loops that exacerbate segregation of neighborhoods by race. That exacerbates it because people pay more for homes in safe neighborhoods. I suspect, by the way, that this likely also runs in reverse, that a widening spread in perceived home values increases the spread in perceived crime because we tend to associate more wealth with more safety. But I'm not putting that in the diagram because I don't have any empirical citation for it. This is my hunch. So notice so far 3 causes, none of which have to do with race. You want to live in a safe neighborhood? You want to get a good return on your investment? You want to live in a good school district? There's a habit, right? These are habits that people have. And this causal loop diagram so far indicates, the analysis so far indicates, that when people act on these habits, they're treating these goods, safety, home investment, and school quality, as more important than the good schools, good economic prospects, and good health for other families. Because typically, the people that are driving this residential segregation by race aren't the people on the low side of the health outcomes spread. They're the people on the high side, because they've got the power to choose where to live, they've got the wealth and the money to do it. And because they're looking out for their own investments, their own safety, their own the education of their own children, it's exacerbating, making worse the economic and health outcomes for other families on the lower end of the spread. Now, Huntsville's approach to school segregation is to take residential segregation as a given, can't control where people live, and try to dampen its effects on school segregation. And so usually when issues of school segregation come up in Huntsville, the city proposes cross-racial busing as a solution, where you'll take some students from racial minority school districts and bus them to schools to white schools where there's racial majorities, and maybe in reverse, although I think that happens less often. It's usually the non-white students being bused into the white schools, the predominantly white schools. Now, it should come as no surprise that evidence continues to show, even with cross-racial busing, evidence continues to show test score disparity. And our causal model nicely explains why. It's because busing does nothing to interfere in the pathway from residential segregation to the spread in test scores. It's coming after that. So here's some, this is some evidence brought up in a recent hearing on desegregation order in Huntsville, it still shows, even with cross-racial busing, there's still these wide disparities in test scores by race. Now, Huntsville does busing between school districts because of the desegregation order, like for a legal reason. But there's some reason to hope that busing might do more than comply with federal law. And that's because if you were to reduce school segregation by race and just follow that pathway, then you'd reduce the spread of economic opportunity, which would reduce the spread of economic outcomes, which would reduce the spread in health outcomes. That's great. Yay, moral benefit. Looks that way. And this isn't all one might hope for from the busing strategy. Because thinking optimistically, you'd expect busing to increase cross-racial interactions. And cross-racial interactions counteract stereotypes. So busing also might be a way to reduce residential segregation by race by changing attitudes about who's criminal, who's not, and so on. Put that as proposed, trying to trace the causal pathway. And so it seems there's a way to block the trade-off that seemed to be present between family-oriented housing preferences and other-oriented social responsibilities. Maybe people can have their safety, good investment, and going to good schools for their family, and not have that translate into other families continuing to have worse health and economic outcomes. But it's just theory. What typically happens in reality is something more cynical. Although the school statistics look more integrated, in the schools, there tends to be more racial segregation. And this is because of attitudes by those in the receiving school district. There tends to be resentment, suspicion, and fear of the racial minority students being bussed in. And of course, then those racial minority students group up with each other and don't integrate. So there's just now segregation in the school. It's also because the people that are getting bussed in are out of their element. They're usually switching economic class, going to school with people from different economic class. They're not sure how to navigate. They often lack the sorts of support from home that their new peers take for granted. Put this as an input into the reinforcing loop that runs through home values, from cross-racial busing to in-school racial segregation, to diminishing cross-racial interactions, increasing perceived criminality, increasing spread of home values. Keep going. And it looks like, if you keep tracing it, it looks like cross-racial busing might amplify residential segregation by race. And then keep tracing it through, it looks like it amplifies the spread in health outcomes. But it's worse, because the standard response, at least in Huntsville, to busing is resistance. Parents driven by habits of wanting to have safe neighborhoods, good home values, send their kids to a good school. Those habits, they don't want their kids vulnerable to crime or disruption or the risk of receiving a lower quality education. And these concerns are the same as the ones that drive residential segregation by race. So this typically means that busing causes more parents to opt for private school. This is a version of what's often called white flight. Now, white flight has all sorts of unfortunate effects. The most immediate is that it exacerbates racial school segregation because the private schools tend to have even less token minority representation. And I've put a picture here of a local private school in Huntsville called Randolph. You can see their statistics by their racial demographics. Now, because white flight takes children out of public school, they're not interacting with the bused students. They're also having less cross-racial interactions overall. If you trace these new arrows through the home values feedback loop, you find yet another way that busing can magnify racial segregation or residential segregation by race. What all this shows is that resisting the busing policy makes the original problem about health outcomes spread even worse. And what's going on, I think, is that busing ignores the real cause of school segregation by race, which is residential segregation by race. And that persists because people use family-centered habits, safe neighborhood, good investment, good school district, to decide where to live. And so efforts to accommodate those habits while preventing the racially disparate vulnerabilities that result are just bound to fail. And they're bound to fail because those habits always recommend against sharing in vulnerability with other people. If you really care about these racially disparate vulnerabilities and outcomes, a better intervention strategy would be to address the cause rather than some intermediate stage. I often see people say we should ban private schools, but note that our causal model shows that won't help. That's not a driving cause. Now, it's a scary habit. It's a scary prospect to live in a less safe neighborhood, to to purchase a house that's not going to be a big return on your investment, to go to a bad school. But if you care about justice with respect to health and economic outcomes, if you think that health and economic outcomes shouldn't be stuck on the low end of those just because of your race, those are the causes to think about. And this, I'll end, just is what causal loop modeling can help you see, system-wide perspective. All right, hope you enjoyed it. It was fun. So long.